Hi everyone, I'm going to do a quick video covering the new features of Darktable 2.0 relative to the old stable release of Darktable 1.6.9. Apologies for the cicadas that you can hear in the background. I live in Melbourne, Australia, and as you can see, summer has kicked in. We have a hot Christmas down here, quite different to what most of you are experiencing, I'm sure. Okay, first things first. This is the new Darktable 2.0 release candidate 4. Obviously there'll be some changes between here and release, but it should represent pretty close to what the release will be. This is Darktable 1.6. You can already see that there's slight visual differences here, and that's mainly because of the switch to GTK 3 from GTK 2. That's a major upgrade of the entire widget toolkit, and that was the main impetus for the major version number being bumped to 2.0. There's a whole bunch of subtle differences that come from the GTK 3 port. I'll go through some of them as I'm working through the system. I'm going to start by having a quick run through of the changes in the light table view, which is this view here. For example, one small change that comes from GTK 3 is the changed scroll bars. They look quite different to those in Darktable 1.6. As you can see, there's this thing which you have to drag. Another nice feature is that you can go all the way to the edge of the screen and just use your mouse wheel, and that scrolls the panes. That's really handy. It's something that I've found really annoying, having to hunt for the bar and then scroll in Darktable 1.6. If you pushed right up against the thing, then the side, then it wouldn't scroll. So anyway, small feature, big improvement in usability. A couple of other things that have improved with the port to GTK 3. High DPI support is improved. Also, you'll notice that the color of the background is slightly different. So in Darktable 1.6 you used to be able to change the brightness and contrast using the F9, F10, F7 and F8 keys. Those no longer work in Darktable 2.0. You have to actually go into, there's a CSS file which controls all of the colors of Darktable 2. So you actually have to go in and edit that CSS file. It's quite easy to do if you want the background to change color. I never really used that feature, so I quite like the sort of grey color that they use here. It's fairly neutral and doesn't affect your perception of the photos too much. Okay, the other major change that's happened in the light table is the new thumbnail cache. The thumbnail cache used to be a little bit buggy in Darktable 1.6. There was a crasher bug where if you opened a file, if you went into the darkroom on a file whilst the thumbnails were being generated, that would often crash Darktable. This complete rewrite has really improved things. I find it a lot smoother and a lot better actually. The other big change that's happened in the light table is that the light table is now color managed. Now this is particularly important if you have a hardware device that you use to calibrate your screen. It just makes everything look a little bit more consistent. Let me just change something in here so that we get the raw thumbnail for this image. Now if I zoom in here, I'll press tab, double click, press tab. Now I'll double click to go back to the light table in the darkroom. You can see that they look very similar now. Alright. Another new feature for the light table is within the file management up here, there's now a trash feature. So if I trash a file within the new version of Darktable, Darktable 2, it will send it to the trash. Now, where's that file gone? How do I restore it? I can restore it by going into my rubbish bin. There's the file that I deleted. I can now right click on that to restore. That'll now be back in this folder. You'll notice that Darktable does not see that file that I just restored. That's because it doesn't know that I restored it, so I need to re-import that folder to re-see that file. If you prefer the old behavior where instead of a trash button you had a delete button, you can change the behavior by going into settings and set this here, send files to trash when erasing images, tick that. As soon as I click close, you'll see that button now goes back to delete. Another new feature in light table is that there's been a bunch of new key bindings added. In Darktable 1.6, there were some key bindings up and down arrows, but you couldn't use the left-right arrows. You couldn't use space or enter in Darktable 1.6. However, in the new version, the arrow keys allow you to move around space toggles whether an image is selected, so you could run through and look at your images and decide which ones you wanted to export, for example. So I can press Enter to select a single image, and then space to select subsequent images. That allows me to just use the arrow keys, scroll through, select the images that I want to export, and then I can do Control-E, for example, to export that image. If I want to go back to selecting a single image again, I can hit Enter. Speaking of exporting images, there's a new export format available. That's the PDF. I've exported my single image there. Here's the PDF output. So there you go. This was, I think, mainly added to assist with printing. Sometimes it's easy to send a PDF to the printer rather than sending an image file. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the darkroom mode now. Let's pull up this image here. The first thing you'll notice is that the drawing area behaves differently in Darktable 2.0. If I scroll in on this image and press Tab, you'll see that there's always a constant border around the image. Whereas in Darktable 1.6, let me switch over here, you'll see that there's no border at the top here. If I zoom in, it fills the whole area. But if I press Tab and I zoom in, I have these borders at the side here. And that's because the drawing area is specified manually here. The first thing I would always do in Darktable 1.6 would be to bring this up and change it to 1920 by 1080 so that it would fill my whole screen. That's no longer necessary in Darktable 2.0. All you have to do is decide how big these borders should be. So if I go in here and select the border width, here we go. So there's been a whole bunch of changes to the darkroom mode, some of them major and some of them minor. I'll just start with the major changes, beginning with the exposure module. So the exposure module always has had a way to automatically determine the best exposure, or at least automatically determine the exposure which the computer decides is most optimal. That mode is still there. It used to be called the automatic mode. I think let's pull it up in 1.6. So here it is in 1.6. So it used to be called the auto mode, and you would tick this and it would change these values based on essentially trying to move these values towards the edge of the histogram. That mode is still there, but it's now activated through this dropper. There we are. So you'll see that it's reasonably similar. It's 0.18. Yeah, so it's slightly different in the two versions, but it is the same algorithm. You can, of course, control which area is used to decide the range. By default, it starts with the whole image, but if you are particularly interested in a certain area, you might select that, for example. However, there is a new automatic mode within the exposure module, and it's based on the deflicker algorithm of Magic Lantern. So because it comes from that algorithm comes from the deflicker of Magic Lantern, it's particularly good for time lapses. So what I might do is pull up a folder. So these images are all taken at the same place at around the same time in reasonably similar lighting conditions. However, metering in your camera is not 100% precise. So if we zoom in on some of these images towards the end here, you'll notice that the sky just fluctuates. The lightness of the sky, and you can see in those last few shots here, the exposure fluctuates. So this is a perfect candidate for that, for the new deflicker mode, as I'll call it, but it's really called the automatic mode. So what I'll do is I'll just open up one of the images, it doesn't matter really which one, in the sequence, and I'll enable the automatic mode. Then I can decide essentially what these percentages mean is what percentage of the values within the histogram, so aggregate, just counting up all of the values in the histogram, what percentage of them should be below this offset. And this offset is relative to the white point of the camera, so it'll always pretty much be negative. So what it's saying is 50% of the values should be below -4 EV relative to the white point of the camera. A little bit technical, but you don't need to really understand that. You can just sort of play with it. And it's easy to play with because it always comes out with the computed EC. So that's the exposure compensation. So essentially what it's doing is it's brightening the image by 0.82 EV, which is a stop in photography parlance. As far as I'm concerned, that's probably overdoing it. Let's turn on the exposure warning. We can see that the sky is slightly blown out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull down this target level until the sky is no longer blown out. I don't really care about these boats so much. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to push up the black point to make the colors a little bit richer, and I'm just doing this by eye. So now we've got this set of settings here. What I can do is switch back to the light table mode, go into the history stack and copy, and I just want to copy that exposure, the modifications that I made to the exposure module. So now I'm going to zoom out just so I can see all my images, and I'm going to select all of the images that are part of my time-lapse, and I'm going to paste that. Now the real benefit of this is that it recalculates every time using its algorithm. So it's not just going to set the exposure compensation to the same for every image. It'll recalculate for every image, and it'll make essentially them all look exactly the same brightness. Okay, so the next major change to the darkroom mode is color reconstruction module. It's a new module in Darktable 2.0. Just enable it here in the More modules. Now, in certain circumstances, the highlight reconstruction that comes by default in Darktable can't deal with, if it's really blown out or you've got a really bright specular highlight on an otherwise fairly consistent field, so like a specular highlight on a shiny car, for example, just pulling back the exposure and using the highlight reconstruction does not get you all of the way. You can see that in this section in the middle of this light, it's admittedly a contrived example, is blown completely, so we just have white, and we're pulling back fairly unrealistic colors on the sides here as well. This is a good candidate for color reconstruction, which essentially just uses a different algorithm to accomplish the same thing. What it essentially does is uses in-painting. So it finds the color around the area that's blown out, and it paints that in towards the center. So if I turn that on, you can see that it's done exactly that. It's turned this entire blown out area into a much more consistent color. Okay, so another module that you might have noticed is new in Darktable 2.0 is this raw black-white 0.1. Now, essentially, this has always existed in Darktable. It's just that this is now exposing it to the UI. It's pulled in from the definition of the camera. So these are the black points for each of the RGB channels within the Bayer pattern, and this is the white point from the camera overall. There's not really any reason why you'd want to change this, to be honest, but it's here nonetheless if you know what you're doing. Another change that's come in is the Shadows and Highlights module now has a new slider. It's the white point adjustment slider. You'll notice that my histogram is hard up against the right hand side, which means that we're blowing some pixels in the highlights. So we now have this white point adjustment. You can see that I'm pulling that back from the edge of the histogram and pulling back any values that exist to the right hand side of the histogram. There can be values to the right hand side of the histogram for various reasons. You might have blown your highlights whilst taking the original photo. You might have increased the exposure through other modules within Darktable, other adjustments that you've done. But this just gives you a more convenient place to pull those back. You'll notice that it affects the whole image equally. So it's a linear adjustment, which is quite different to the highlights adjustment that you see here, where it only affects the right hand side of the histogram. And you can see that it's essentially masked off so that only the brightest parts are affected, whereas the white point adjustment affects the whole image linearly. This is very similar. You could choose to do a tone curve and pull down the right hand side. Very similar effect. It's just that it's extra clicks. So it's a little bit more convenient to do it straight through the Shadows and Highlights module there. Okay, so now we've got some other changes. The white balance module now reports the Kelvin values in a more comparable way to other programs. If you use Raw Therapy or Lightroom, for example, those should now be more equivalent. Internally, it's still the same within Darktable, but it just shows you those values in a more normal way. Additionally, if we switch to a preset here, there are more fine-tunes supported for various different models, and that comes from Darktable being able to interpolate those. If it only has the values for +9 and -9, it can now interpolate all of the other values in between. So you might see this slider now enabled for your camera, where it may not have been before. Another major change to the Darktable is the addition of text watermarks. So there's always been watermarks, or at least there was in Darktable 1.6, but now you can do a much quicker version by simply typing in here. If we use simple text SVG, you can see that I now have a watermark across my image. So it's just added the text part. Previously you had to create your own SVG and show that yourself, but this is a little bit simpler for you now. Another behind the scene change is in Denoise profiled. In Darktable 1.6, the profiles were stored within the actual source code of Darktable. Now they've been moved out into a JSON file, so that if you profile your camera, it's much easier to just copy paste those in whilst you're waiting for them to be accepted by the Darktable developers. There's a new demosaic mode. I'm just going to go through this reasonably quickly. Demosaic now has a pass-through monochrome mode. It's still experimental. It's really only useful if you've got a camera that's been modified to remove the Bayer RGB filters, such as this camera here. If I just zoom in here, you'll see that the demosaic has caused an overall sort of yellow cast, and you can see these blue and red dots as part of this. Each of the different demosaic algorithms will give you different color problems. So if I now switch to the monochrome demosaic, you'll see that that's completely cleaned up. The crop module has been changed quite significantly. You'll see that there's now the list of aspects goes from the squarest to the widest, and there's been some additional ones added. Also, it's possible to add your own to the configuration file, the Darktable configuration file. That Darktable configuration file by default is in .config Darktable RC. So you can add your own crop in there. Check out the manual if you'd like to see how to do that. It's also possible to type aspects. I think this has always been there, but I just discovered it recently. If you right click on here and then type an aspect, say, I don't know, 10 to 5, that now gives you that crop aspect. Let's do a fun one. Let's do 10 to 1, for example. So another thing that's changed is the ability to change the size, opacity, and hardness of the brush using keyboard accelerators. It's now a square bracket to make it larger and smaller, so the two square brackets, angle brackets to change the opacity, and squiggly brackets to change the hardness. You've always been able to do this with the mouse, so that's wheel up and down, shift wheel up and down, and control wheel up and down, but it's just another option for changes there. Another nice change within Darktable 2.0 is it used to be that if you made some changes to an image, you rolled back slightly on the history stack, you left the darkroom, did something else and came back to that image, the changes that you made were lost. These ones above here in the history were dropped and lost completely. In Darktable 2.0 they're retained, so you can always go back to what you were last editing if you so desire. Another small change within the Darktable is the ability to add nodes to any curve by pressing Control click. You no longer need to click directly on the curve, you can just Control click and it can be away from the curve and so forth, but it adds a node. So you can see that there. The final thing that's worth mentioning about new Darktable 2.0 is that the output color profile module has changed quite significantly. A lot of the functionality has now moved into here. So what I'll just do is I'll show you a direct comparison with Darktable 1.6.9. So the output color profile you can see has more fields here. Those fields have just moved to the right click here. So the softproof profile and the display profile are there. You can now softproof and gamut check using these two buttons directly. The other thing that's worth mentioning is the little CMS support. If we enable little CMS support here, you'll see that there's additional entries added here. Okay, so there's only a couple of things that I've got left to cover. One is that there's now an elevation listed here in the image information that goes along with the geotag. I've imported a geotagged photo here somewhere. Here it is. You can see that I've got lat long, but it has no elevation. But if there was elevation in this geotag, it would show up here. The next thing that I want to cover is the print feature. This is a new feature in Darktable 2.0. I'll just run through quickly what the various settings are. So I've chosen a PDF printer because I don't currently have a physical printer attached, and I don't have any printer-specific ICC profiles. But if I did have a physical printer, I'd probably have a profile for the printer plus the paper, so the printer-paper combination. Then I would have an intent, which is very similar to the intent down here, so perceptual, relative colorimetric, saturation, or absolute colorimetric. Normally you would use perceptual, because that tries to compress the gamut of the image itself down into the gamut that the printer has. Normally the printer's gamut smaller, in such a way that it appears most natural. But there's good reasons to use all of the other ones as well. Paper size, orientation are fairly standard. Millimeters is just what it's using to specify the margins, which I've got here currently locked. Obviously if I increase the margins, they'll increase all around the paper. If I unclick that, then I can select them to be uneven. Then within the printable area, this grey area, I can choose whether to center it, left, right, in the middle, the top, in the corner, that kind of thing. Finally, there's this scale factor. Now, this is telling me whether it's being upscaled or downscaled. If it's greater than 1, then it's being upscaled, which means that the resolution is low. You can see it's DPI of 63, but that's because I'm printing on a ridiculously huge 4A piece of paper. Let's go down to A4, which is much more normal size of paper, and we can see that it's now less than 1, which means that we're getting a full 300 DPI. This DPI is detected from the printer. And finally, at the bottom here, we have the print settings. You'll notice that there's a second profile drop-down, just like the profile drop-down at the top. What this does is it applies the profile to the image as it's being exported, if you like. So Darktable will export the raw to an internal image representation, a 16-bit image representation. It'll apply the profiles and the intents here. And normally, during a standard export, that would be saved to a file, a JPEG file or a TIFF file. But with printing, that's kept internally, and then it's sent up and it's run through this profile next. So you can think of it as a cascade, if you like. Now, normally, I've got one in here for my own camera, but normally you just see sRGB and Adobe RGB. Image settings will by default be sRGB, and that's generally fine. Unless you know that there's some part of your printer's gamut which is outside of sRGB but contained within Adobe RGB. I think sRGB is a fine default. The intent is the same as before, perceptual, etc. Now the style, you'll see I've got dual denoise selected here, so that's the style that I've defined before in the light table. You've got two choices. You can either replace history or append history. What that means is, for the modules that you've activated within this style, do you replace the corresponding modules that were defined when you edited this image itself? That's what will happen if you do replace history. If you do append history, then you will append any modules that you've changed here to any modules that you've changed here. So let's say, for example, in dual denoise, I have 2 instances of profile denoise. Let's say, for example, I'd already applied a profile denoise to my image, then I would have 3 instances of profile denoise applied before the print occurred. So finally, you just press the print button. That sends it to the printer, and normally it would come out as a hard copy, but because I'm using a PDF, I get my PDF. The last thing I'd like to cover is the Lua scripting engine within Darktable. There's a bunch of Lua scripts now in this repository here. There's the official ones created by the official Darktable developers, plus there's some scripts here that have been contributed by other people, and you can apply to have your scripts contributed if you're a Lua developer. So you can download and enable these scripts. I've done that with one, which I'll just quickly show you. It's under the official directory. It's selection to PDF. It has some dependencies, but once you've installed that and you've set up the Lua file to be loaded into Darktable, you get an additional export here. Export thumbnails to PDF. It essentially creates something quite similar to a contact sheet, if you remember the old film days. So if I click export, you can see my 15 images now being exported to the PDF. And there it is, my contact sheet, complete with file names. So Lua will become more and more exciting over time as more hooks are added to Darktable and as more scripts are written. Okay, well, that's the final thing that I wanted to cover. I hope you enjoy using Darktable 2.0. I'm very excited about this release. I think it's going to be a great one. See you later.